London, May 19, 1536. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the air was heavy with fog and silence. A wooden scaffold had been built during the night in the courtyard of the Tower of London, but it wasn't the usual kind. This one sat low to the ground, with no tall frame, no axe on display, just a flat wooden surface, plain, clean, and quiet. Standing near it was a man dressed in dark clothes. He wasn't English. He carried no hood, no axe. Just a long, thin sword that looked almost too polished to kill with. The crowd gathered slowly, quietly. No one shouted, no one laughed. Even the guards avoided eye contact. And then she appeared. A small woman in her mid-30s, calm. She walked without chains, without struggle. She wore a gray cloak with fur lining, her posture straight, her steps steady, beneath the gray. If you looked closely, was deep red, the kind of red that wouldn't show blood. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stood where they told her. Her name was Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, and this was the morning she was going to die. Anne Boleyn wasn't supposed to be queen. She wasn't royalty. She wasn't a great beauty. She didn't fit the mold of what a queen looked like in the 1500s. Her skin was darker than the fashion of the time, olive-toned, not pale. Her eyes were sharp, not soft. Her hair, a deep black, framed a face that many called striking, but few called pretty. Still, wherever she went, people looked, and once they didn't forget her. She was smart, educated. She spoke French fluently. She could hold her own in any conversation, whether it was politics, religion, or art. She had presence, she had confidence, and in a royal court full of whispers and masks. Anne Boleyn spoke plainly. When King Henry VIII noticed her, everything changed. At the time, he was still married to Queen Catherine of Aragon, but Catherine had failed to give him a male heir, something Henry was obsessed with. He turned his attention to Anne, but she wasn't like the others. Anne didn't flirt. She didn't fold. She didn't want to be another mistress like her sister Mary had been. She wanted more. "If you want my body and my heart," she reportedly told the king, "then put a crown on my head." It was a dangerous move, arrogant, even. But Henry was hooked. He fought for 7 years to have her. He broke from the Catholic Church. He pushed England into religious upheaval. He created a new church, the Church of England, just to make Anne his wife. And in 1533, he did. Anne became Queen of England, not by birth, not by inheritance, but by changing the entire country's religion and ripping apart the world order of the time. She gave birth to a daughter, a girl whom Henry barely acknowledged. That girl would grow up to become Queen Elizabeth II. But Anne didn't know that yet. She only knew her time as queen had started under fire. And now, just 3 years later, it would end by sword. Power never stays quiet for long. At first, Anne was untouchable. Henry had risked everything to marry her, his church, his reputation, his soul. She had given him political confidence, a new religious direction, and even a second wind in popularity. For a time, she was the center of the English court. But admiration doesn't last in a world built on ego and blood. Anne's strength, her boldness, her voice, her refusal to play by the rules began to wear thin. What had once been seen as alluring was now dangerous. What had once made her stand out now made her a threat. And most of all, she had failed to deliver what Henry wanted most, a son. After giving birth to Elizabeth, Anne became pregnant again in 1534 but lost the baby. A year later, another pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. This time, it had been a boy. For a king obsessed with legacy, it was the final straw. Henry began to drift, first emotionally, then politically. And Anne could feel it. But while her grip on the king weakened, her enemies sharpened theirs. The most dangerous among them was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief advisor, and one of the most cunning political minds in Europe. Cromwell had once supported Anne. She had been useful a weapon to break the Catholic Church. But now she was unpredictable, outspoken, and in the way. Cromwell wanted stability. Anne was chaos. And chaos, in court, gets removed. In the spring of 1536, Cromwell began to move. Quietly, precisely. He gathered rumors, whispers of flirtation, secret conversations, glances held too long. Then he fed them to the king. Not all at once, just enough to spark doubt. It worked. In April, Cromwell opened an official investigation. The charge adultery, a queen accused of cheating on her king. But that wasn't all. They added incest, saying she had slept with her own brother, George Boleyn. And they added treason, saying she plotted to kill Henry himself. None of it made sense. The men accused had little connection to Anne. There was no evidence, no real witnesses. But this wasn't about proof. It was about removal. On May 2nd, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same place where, just days later, she would die. She wasn't given time to prepare. She wasn't allowed to speak to the king. She didn't even know exactly what she had done wrong. When she stepped inside the tower gates, she reportedly looked around and said, "Is this where I must leave my judgment to God?" In a matter of days, her entire world had vanished. Her crown, her marriage, her name. All that was left was the sword, and that sword was already waiting for her. Anne Boleyn never stood a chance. The trial was set for May 15th, 1536, less than 2 weeks after her arrest. It was held in the Tower itself, in the same place where she had once celebrated her coronation. Now, she was a prisoner in her own palace. The courtroom was packed, but it wasn't a fair fight. The jury included men who openly despised her, men whose power she had threatened, men who owed their loyalty to Thomas Cromwell, and through him, to the king. Anne was not allowed a lawyer. She couldn't question witnesses. She wasn't even told all of the charges in full, but she still spoke. Witnesses said she defended herself with grace, not loud, not desperate, but steady. One man described her as more like an angel than a woman. She answered every accusation with logic, clarity, and the calm of someone who knew the verdict had already been written, because it had. Anne had been condemned before she ever entered the room. This trial wasn't about guilt. It was about permission. Permission for Henry to move on, and for Cromwell to clean up the mess. Still, Anne didn't fall apart. She stood in front of her enemies, in the same posture she had once used at court, and looked them in the eyes. She denied every charge. She denied ever being unfaithful. She denied plotting against the king. She denied any unnatural relationship with her brother. It didn't matter. The jury left the room. When they returned, they read the sentence without hesitation. Guilty on all counts. The punishment by English law. Treason by a queen meant burning. Anne was to be tied to a stake and burned alive, a death reserved for the worst kind of betrayal. But Henry stepped in. whether out of mercy, guilt, or just a desire to look civilized to the rest of Europe. He changed the sentence. She would be beheaded, and not with the English axe. He had already arranged for a French swordsman brought in from Calais, known for his skill and speed. To many, this was seen as a kinder death. To Anne, it meant something else: finality. She would not scream. She would not burn. She would kneel, and that would be it. Anne was told of the change in her sentence with less than a week to live. She spent her final days in the Tower Chapel praying, reading, waiting. She told her ladies she was ready. She told them she forgave her enemies. She told them in a quiet moment that she hoped her daughter would be safe. On the night before her execution, she slept lightly. At one point, she asked what time it was. A lady replied, "Almost dawn." Anne nodded and whispered, "Then I have not long to be here." She had no illusions left, no plea for rescue, no chance of pardon. The sword had already crossed the channel, and in just hours, it would fall. May 19th, 1536. It should have happened at dawn. Anne had risen early. She had prayed. She had taken communion. She was ready. But just after sunrise, a messenger came to her chamber. The execution had been delayed. The swordsman wasn't yet in place. She would wait for 4 more hours. Anne sat in the Tower Chapel, not pacing, not crying, just waiting. She spoke to no one unless spoken to. Occasionally, she whispered the same words over and over: "Jesus, receive my soul." At noon, the drums began. Outside, the crowd had gathered about 1,000 people, fewer than expected. Some were nobles, some were servants. Others had come simply because they heard a queen would die today. There was no shouting, no jeering, just silence. Anne stepped out into the courtyard. She wore the same gray cloak lined with fur. Her crimson gown showed at the edges as she walked. Her posture was straight, her chin high. When she reached the scaffold, she turned to her ladies, the few who had stayed with her, and handed them a small prayer book, a token, something to hold after she was gone. She climbed the wooden steps alone. She looked out over the crowd, then turned to face the executioner. He was already in position. Anne was offered the chance to speak. She accepted. Her final words were calm. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, according to law, and by law I am judged to die. I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for never had a more gentle or sovereign lord than he." She did not defend herself. She did not accuse. In those last lines, she chose survival, not for herself, but for her daughter. Then she removed her headdress and cloak. Her hair was tucked back. She knelt. Upright, there would be no block, not for a sword. One of her ladies stepped forward, blindfolded her gently. She continued whispering, "O Lord God, have mercy on my soul." The executioner, trained in France, used a trick of mercy. He raised his sword silently, then called out, "Where is my sword?" Anne turned her head slightly, as if to help him find it. That was the moment. He struck once, clean, final. There was no cheer, no roar of approval, only the low hum of disbelief. As the executioner raised her head and spoke the required words, "So perish all the king's enemies." But even he seemed unsure this time. The wind had picked up by midday. Anne stood on the scaffold, her hands steady, her breath measured. Around her, The crowd waited in near silence, as if afraid to make a sound louder than hers. She turned to her ladies, the handful who remained, and handed them small gifts one by one. A prayer book, still warm from her fingers, a silk handkerchief, embroidered, a simple gold ring. Not farewell presents, memorials, pieces of her, left behind. Then she stepped forward, toward the edge of the platform, her cloak still draped over her shoulders, gray and lined with fur. But beneath it, the crimson bodice showed. She had chosen it carefully, the color wouldn't show blood. There was no priest, no family, just the executioner, the platform, and the eyes of 1,000 strangers. Anne removed her headdress and handed it to one of her women. Her long dark hair was pulled back, exposing the slim line of her neck. She knelt upright, no block. The French did it differently. She adjusted herself once, closed her eyes, then whispered something to God that no one could hear. The executioner stood behind her, silent. Then, in a sharp voice, he called out, "Where is my sword?" It was a trick one he had used before. His sword was already in his hand, raised. The call was meant to distract her, to give her one last moment without fear. Anne turned her head slightly at the sound, just enough to show her profile to the crowd, and then the blade fell. One clean stroke, a flash, a sound not loud, but final, like the last page of a book closing too fast. Her body didn't move. It simply folded. The executioner stepped forward, picked up her head by the hair, and held it high. He said what was required, so perish the king's enemies. But no one cheered, no one shouted. The silence stayed. Some said the air turned colder in that moment. Others claimed they saw her lips still moving after the blade had struck, whether true or not. What remained was simple. The Queen was dead, and within an hour, Henry VIII would receive a signal, a single cannon blast, across the river. It meant the execution was done. He could remarry now. His throne was cleared. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was gone. No music, no mourning. Just the sound of footsteps leaving the courtyard, one by one. There was no coffin. After the crowd had left and the executioner stepped down, Anne's ladies gathered her body. There had been no preparations for burial, no casket, no priest, no ceremony. The guards brought out what they could find, an old wooden chest, once used to store arrows. Anne's remains were placed inside her head, laid beside her body. No silk, no wrapping, just a narrow, splintered box, nailed shut in silence. They buried her beneath the floor of the chapel at the Tower St. Peter ad Vincula, the church of prisoners and traitors. No marker, no name, no royal seal, just stone. Within hours, it was as if she had never existed. 10 days later, Henry VIII was engaged to Jane Seymour. 10 days. The ink on Anne's execution warrant hadn't even faded. The Queen was gone, and the King had moved on. But that wasn't enough. Henry ordered every portrait of Anne destroyed, every emblem scraped from the palace walls, every mention of her name removed from the official records. It was a full damnatio memoriae, a Roman punishment designed not just to kill, but to erase. For years afterward, no image of Anne Boleyn could be found, no public memory, no tribute. She had been a queen, and now she was a ghost. Anne Boleyn was gone, buried in silence, stripped from records, her name all but erased. But history doesn't always do what kings want. 23 years later, the daughter Henry had once dismissed, the child Anne had died for, became Queen of England, Elizabeth I. She ruled for 45 years. It was not a reign of chaos or scandal. It was a golden age, a time of art, science, expansion, and stability. The girl Henry had barely acknowledged, the one he had almost erased along with her mother, built an empire he could only dream of, and she didn't forget where she came from. Elizabeth adopted the white falcon as her royal emblem, a direct symbol of Anne Boleyn. The falcon, once painted on Anne's throne, scraped off by order of the king, was now engraved in gold above England's new sovereign. Anne did not rise from the grave. But her daughter, the one born into disappointment, rose high enough to bury Henry's legacy instead. That's the cruel symmetry of history. The axe may fall, the tomb may stay unmarked, but memory has a way of clawing back through the cracks. What do we take from this? That truth is not always told in the moment. That power buries what it fears, and that even when someone is silenced, their story may still echo loud enough to outlive the throne that tried to crush it. If you found meaning in this story, if it made you rethink how history treats the fallen, consider sharing it. Because Torture Vault isn't just about how people died, it's about why they were made to die and who needed them forgotten, so they wouldn't become dangerous, even after death.